Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. Good to be back at Buddy Brew. We are on bay to bay, different locations, so I'm getting used to, I have a fun swivelly chair. What we don't have is traffic flying by, which could be good, could be bad, if you know the backstory to that. But this is a conversation I've wanted to have for a long, long time. And I'll just set the context like this. According to Pew Research, approximately 66 million Americans, that's 1 in 4 people in our country, are living in a multi-generational context. That means kids, grandkids, parents moving back together. There's this emerging trend where families are coming back together. 1 in 4 Americans are experiencing that kind of context. In 1940, about 1/4 of the U.S. population lived like that. You would come home and grandma would be there. Grandkids would be there. That was just more normal back in 1940. In World War II, that changed. Life changed, and the trend started to shift, and it moved from 3 generational families to 2 generational families. We started living more in our own context. We would have parents and kids, but grandparents were in another context. The suburbs expanded and moved out. We had sprawl. We got further apart. We started commuting back and forth to church. Life changed in all sorts of ways. And then we started to wrestle through questions about, well, what do we do with aging parents? How do we care for people with dignity? How do we care for young parents who are raising kids and being stretched thin? How do we keep those family bonds tight when we used to be so close to each other and we were handing things legacy down from generation to generation? Are we missing something? But the trend increased. It peaked in the 80s, in the wild 80s. That was the height of kind of living on our own, doing our own thing. And since the 80s, it's kind of been trending back down, but it's been gradual until the '08 recession. And then the giant shove was the COVID pandemic, and it disrupted everything. And so now today, we're finding ourselves in America asking new questions, big questions, and it gives us the opportunity to uncover, as we say, enchanted reality. And so I had just the opportunity to meet this couple. I'm going to introduce them in just a second, but I stumbled upon something that was enchanting, and I thought, let's put it on the table. This is a backdrop that 66 million Americans, 1 in 4 of us, are thinking about this right now. And coming up, there's going to be a gigantic, the most significant generational shift that's taken place in our country is about to, we're on the threshold of it as the boomer generation ages, and we start to scratch our head and say, how do we, again, care for people with dignity? Think about legacy and ask ourselves what's most important and what are we willing to give up maybe for treasure that we maybe have missed. So my guest tonight to have the conversation, Dr. Michael Metzger. He's the founder of the Clapham Institute based in Annapolis, Maryland. The Institute's mission is resourcing Christians for the next 50 years. And they resource Christians who recognize that the Western church is in exile. It's an outsider operating outside the arenas in which the greatest influence in culture is exerted. During the last 20 years, Mike has consulted for some of the world's top companies. He writes a weekly column that I enjoy and will send links to that. And he comments on the public world, what is going on in our culture and how to think about that. He's also becoming a dear friend to V3 and helping us think through what it is to uncover enchanted reality. So Mike, thank you so much for being here. Kathy, his wife, is next to him. Kathy Metzger grew up in Tennessee and Kentucky. She finished college at Western Kentucky and then went on staff with Campus Crusade until she found her way down to LSU, where she and Mike were working together. She's been a mom full-time, and in the midst of doing mom full-time and supporting ministry and doing all the things that you do, you've also been teaching kids to fall in love with reading and doing that for 19 years, helping kids in a low-income school district help fall in love with reading and nurturing them. So Mike and Kathy, say hello to them. Thank you so much for coming down. That's a lot. That's a ton, yeah. Annapolis, Maryland. I got to go visit. I'll say that more about that. But what's it like in Annapolis right now? We all were kind of feeling chilly today, but tell us really quickly what you left when you flew down.
Well, it was actually 54, which is not bad for Annapolis this time of year for February.
Yeah, we don't even know what's going on.
That's right. So it's a town that's a big boating town in the summertime. There's Anne Arundel County, where the Annapolis area is, has the most coastline of any county on the East Coast, which might surprise you. So there's a lot of boating. Every year there's a sailing.
Three now.
Oh, three?
Yeah,
You can
three
speak up.
international boating weekends.
Boating
People from around the world.
shows.
Yeah, boating
Yeah.
shows.
So it's a
we
fun
can't afford
place.
a boat, but it's great to be there. We have friends with boats.
There's history, like you can trip in the middle of that town square and fall on something that is meaningful and historic. Say, Mike, really quickly, because you were driving me around town, chapel in the center, famous historic chapel, then Washington gives a speech. Give just a quick snapshot of the historic nature of Annapolis for people who don't know.
Well, Annapolis is 1639, first of all, and then second, it's really built around the old ancient vision in the gospel of how cities built around circles and spheres, because God was viewed as a sphere, and so the highest sphere circle in the city is state. About 5 feet below that is church circle, because the church assisted in the flourishing of the state, and then you have the spokes coming out, and so you have all sorts of things. This is where Washington resigned as commander, where it was a national capital for 8 months as they were transitioning from Philadelphia to Washington. It's where Lafayette and Washington used to entertain women, and there's a balcony you can go see where the women would come out and wave at Lafayette when he came by. Something about Frenchmen, and you also have just a lot of extraordinary events took place. Abraham Lincoln walked through town, just with Seward on his way down to negotiate, not negotiate, but to meet with Confederate officials who were thinking about wanting to bring an end to the war. He just came to the end of the line and walked right through town.
It's incredible. This is one of the things that I fell in love with when Mike and I got to be friends. I had Mike on the podcast quite a while ago, and just through another invitation, and then we started having more conversations, and I found that he kind of knows everything about everything. And as we drove around, I was like, how does this guy know about all of these different things? You must stay up at night exploring those things. But it was good. It's a good city to go visit if you haven't been there. You would love it. Those are bright headlights shining in and making our camera shot change. But I loved the idea of the spheres and the way that Annapolis was built. And originally, I thought we were going to have a conversation about the music of the spheres, and I was dreaming about Lewis's vision of enchantment, and you were an expert in that sphere, and so I thought, well, that's what we'll talk about. But the last time we got together for a podcast, you just mentioned that you and Kathy were living with your kids, adult kids. And against that backdrop and the COVID change, something planted in my mind, and I was curious. I was stirring on it. And then in December, I traveled up and spent some time with you all in your home. And what I stumbled on in the home was, like I said, enchanting. I stumbled into this place where there was grandparents, there were grandkids, there were adult kids. We were around a table. There was a meal. It was beautiful. It was what I imagined family, the possibility of multi-generational family life being. And I thought, this is too good to be true. And the first night I went to sleep in the house, I was in a guest room, and I thought, this is all kind of fake. Like, this is no, we can't really do life like this. And you would have had to give up something crazy or be crazy to give up what you gave up. So in order to kind of get the context, I want Kathy, would you give a little bit of perspective? Because you were not forced to make the choice to live with your adult kids. You came together as a family and said, we want to do this. And Mike, I'm going to pull on that thread in a second. But Kathy, set the backdrop, because you were living in this beautiful house. You could throw a tennis ball across the street into the university lawn. You were living in a big house with ministry and people in your home. Tell us a little bit about the work you were doing with Clapham and what happened before you moved in.
Sure. Now 7 years ago, we moved from the house where we had raised our children to downtown Annapolis. We were right down the street from the Capitol. And we lived in a home that was built in 1886. It was something that was purchased by our Clapham Institute. So we didn't own it. Our institute owned it. But we just got the privilege of living there and of stewarding that home. And it was a beautiful home. It had a guest wing where there were 3 bedrooms and a bath. So we had lots of different people come and stay with us for marriage weekends, for just getaway weekends, for prayer weekends. We had events. over the course of those 6 years that we lived there, we had over 8,000 people in our home for events. So we had everything from a jazz musician who talked about music to the commandant from the Naval Academy, which is 2 blocks away, to authors and a vintner and all sorts of different people that we hosted. We had fundraisers for different children's hospital in Africa. Any way that we felt like we could use that home as a place for people to come together to do good, for the common good. Whether it was Christian or non-Christian, we wanted that to be a place where people could come and feel that they were welcomed and that they would sense, that my prayer was always that they would sense the Spirit there, and that people who would come in that didn't know the Lord would be drawn to Him through that. So it was really a wonderful 6 years that God gave us there.
When it was, Mike describes the students just walking across the lawn, kind of the open door policy, 8,000 people hanging out in your house. And that's the kind of people that you both are. So it's not strange to do life then in layers or with layers, because you were doing that. You had 8,000 people through your home. Mike, was it strategic? You're a thoughtful guy and a visionary guy. Were you seeing the landscape, and did you initiate this kind of conversation within your family and say, hey, family, there's something important from a values level that we want to approach this? Or was it kind of serendipity and it came up in a different way? How did it come up with you and your kids that you would try this out, all living together?
Oh, you mean after we left Clapham House?
Yeah, the move from
Well,
Clapham.
it was Pat and Jennifer. It was we have 3 married kids, so we have 6 kids, adults. Kids doesn't really work anymore. They're something, and and actually Pat and Jennifer, who had built a home 5 minutes from us over in West Annapolis, they said they wanted to sell, and they sat down in the kitchen and said, we want to live together. We want our kids to grow up with you guys. And of course, I'm just booing, and Kathy had a little different take.
Well, I was a little more reserved. Living with your daughter when you've raised them and they're out on their own and all of a sudden they're wanting to live with you again, it's like, can we be good friends and live together like this? I'm just not sure how that's going to work, but it's been amazing.
Yeah.
What was their why? I mean, I did some research ahead of this conversation, and I was looking at like the declining birth rate in the U.S. and the millennial perspective on, hey, we have so much college debt, we're delaying decisions, and we're not able to afford our own housing because the market's crazy and inflation. Was it economic? What was the why driving or pulling them in this direction?
Well, they watched me clean the house for 8,000 people, and they figured, let's get this guy and have him live with us.
Get a job.
And, it wasn't economic. I think, so I came out of a family, 4 boys, and we were not close. And it's a grief to this day. We all fled Michigan. We fled our parents. And it was a broken family. And Kathy and I, when we got married, we covenanted that, because her family was radically different, that we were going to break the cycle. But to break that cycle takes a lot of work. It took a lot of, me telling the truth about my terrible, upbringing in a way. And it was painful. It's painful to this day. My father passed away just down in Venice a few years ago and didn't even bother to tell anyone, just sort of passed away. And so we said we're going to break that cycle. And, one of the things that we feel that we learned in growing together is most kids never become adult to adult with their adult parents. And most marriages even are adult to adult. There's usually a parent and a kid. So Kathy and I worked hard to be adult to adult and then to raise adults. And I just think that Pat and Jennifer and Mark and Christy and Stephen and Sarah, they've felt that. And it's just kind of oozed out of us. And it wasn't anything that we ever really did. And I think because of that, they said, I've read the studies that the average child cannot name their great-grandparents. So they said they wanted to break the cycle too.
It's interesting. I'm sitting here listening to you say that most of us couldn't name our great-grandparent or our great-great-grandparent. And it feels like history starts with us a little bit more. The church struggles with this, like, right? We orient from our date and our time, and we have a hard time broadening or widening out that context. And I think it's true at a relational level too, that our stories are we're kind of told, like, go start your life and start your story and build some traditions, and we've accepted that narrative, but we've lost some stuff. You all are deeply Lewis people and have thought about this enchanted background and this backdrop. What is it about family generationally? I just want you to talk about that a little bit from your perspective, the importance of generational life together. Is it worth it? Is it worth reimagining that? Is it worth facing the pain of saying, hey, my family, there's some deep wounds, and I don't know if it's worth going back to that to try to step over that. Just go for a little bit on, is it worth it? And why is that important? That kind of recovering that multi-generational layer.
I'll start. I read a book by Edith Schaefer. Some of you may be familiar with the Schaefers, called What is a Family? And I will never forget the illustration that she used in this book, because she uses the picture of a mobile and how the family is connected. And that's the picture that I still have in my mind of having adult children. And now we have 10 grandchildren, number 11 on the way. And my family was very different from Mike's. My family, I grew up in kind of in the hills of East Tennessee, where I visited grandparents every Sunday. And my great-grandmother lived with my grandparents when she was older. And then my father died right after Mike and I were married. And my brother, who's 14 years older than I am, never married. And my mom had rheumatoid arthritis. And my brother took care of my mom for 30 years. And so we feel that now, as he's aging, he's our responsibility to take care of. And so we made sure when we went into this with our daughter and son-in-law that they understood that they might also have my brother at some point living with us as well. But both sets of my parents were from families of 6 children, and I was just always really close to my cousins and my aunts and uncles. And so I had an incredible opportunity that I realize a lot of people don't have. With as many broken homes as there are, I realize that I'm the lucky one. You know, I'm really fortunate to have experienced all that. And so I've always grown, you know, as the children were growing in our home, I did everything I could to just reinforce the idea of their siblings being their best friends. That's who they were going to do life with. And so for me, just that whole perspective of how crucial a family is, yes, it's worth it, because those are memories that you have forever. I still remember my grandmother making all of the granddaughters matching flannel nightgowns, and I didn't have a sister. And so for my cousins to have matching nightgowns with me was a big deal. And, you know, I still buy, every time we have a family vacation together or Christmas holiday, I always buy all my grandkids matching PJs just for that reason.
They're young enough that they like that.
Yeah, they're 10 and under, so we can get away with it a
works, yeah.
little longer.
I remember reading What is a Family, and I remember the mobile, and I remember how enchanting that was, and how curious I thought it was as I was reading Edith Schaefer's work and her vision of a family and the way that she described it. I loved Francis Schaeffer's theology, but it was actually Edith that made me interested in that. She was more alluring in what she wrote about. I wanted more of that than I did even the head level stuff. But that mobile picture is really interesting. Back to the conversation about the music of the spheres. Mike, is there, like in the Jewish tradition, lineage, it's important, maybe more in some cultures than it has been in the West. What have we lost in our modern or postmodern perspective that we don't even know what we don't know in terms of reality itself? You think about the music of the spheres, the planets themselves moving in a harmony, in this unheard music that envelops us. Is there something about the presence of multiple generations that's actually gives us, it pings with what's more real that maybe we've lost sight of? And how can we maybe peer through a different perspective?
Well, that's 3, 4, 5 good questions.
I like to throw them just one after another.
Well, first of all, the old joke is if you feel like you overmarried, then you have a great marriage. And this is emotional for Kathy and I in many ways because I really do feel like overmarried. And in terms of when I first met her family, I freaked out. I mean, they hugged me and I just went, but it was alluring. I just said, what is this? And so it took for me a sort of a breaking to go, I don't know much about family. And that's a very freeing, just come clean. And because my father was all head knowledge too. He was brilliant, but he wasn't approachable. And Kathy's family's hugging all over me. I didn't even know where I was in East Tennessee. I was really groping around like, is there a newspaper somewhere? Where are we? And but I owe all this to Kathy. I really do. And she has had an impact in our family, my family, with my brothers and sister. I mean, I could tell you a story. I won't, because it would embarrass my brother if he ever heard me tell it. But she kind of just pierced through some of the facade in our family as someone who was a brand new face that everybody just went, oh, that's how families do it. So I would say that. And I would recommend, if you've not watched Barry Levinson's film Avalon. How many of you ever heard of Avalon? So I don't think I could say it as well as Barry Levinson. So Barry Levinson is a filmmaker. He's made, all of you got your iPhone out and you can find all the movies he made. But it's a story of his Jewish Eastern European immigrants coming to America, Baltimore, right around 1914. And it goes through 1969. So I'm not going to give it away, but when they first come, they come into the docks in Baltimore, and they end up at this this little turret apartment right there. And of course, in a tradition of many places, they name it Avalon. And parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, they all just kind of stuff in all together. And I want you to watch the movie, because there's a couple of things that happen that we won't talk about tonight just for the sake of time, but the automobile, the Interstate Highway Act, 1956. You just have all these forces that remove one thing: proximity. So there was an excellent article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about the challenge for so many parents because the grandparents may live in California and they're here and so on and so forth. Remember, there was Montesquieu who said, I'm not sure democracy can work without proximity. He didn't think it could spread across the country. Family doesn't work that way either, and proximity was never a problem. So I do a kind of a quick snapshot that in Judaism, and the influence they had was that the homes that were built, when they say he goes off to prepare a home, that was generally attached to the domicile of the parents. Now, there wasn't a pass-through, but it was just attached. That's why Joseph was probably pretty shocked about Mary, because he wasn't off in a far-off country. He was next door preparing a place and finds out she's pregnant. And so towns built from the center out by these building on. And that's how they emerged. And that was collapsed under Islam, came back actually with the Roman Catholic Church in an excellent book that just came out in 2020 on this impact that it made that broke up clans, feudal systems. And it was a whole view of marriage, that families, that the author makes the case this gave rise to this flourishing of the Renaissance and eventually this capitalism and so on and so forth. Now, my whole point in this is that these families required proximity. And most people wouldn't know that before the Industrial Revolution, the major economic engine in every society was the home. That's why they were called a cottage industry. So all that to say, the challenges of what we're doing are enormous. And Avalon, I've actually shown this around the world, and I watch often people get up and leave and they cry and they go, that was my family. Now I see why we came apart. Now I see why we don't see one another. It was actually the story of my family too in Flint, Michigan. So I don't know if that answers your question, except to say it takes a great deal of intention. Now, one of the reasons we're called Clapham Institutes, one of their mottos was neighbors, then neighborhood. So the reason it's called Clapham is they started to do work to abolish the slave trade and all sorts of things. They lived in and around London, and they realized they read the tale of Serendip, which was making a renewal at that time, a 15th century tale, and it was about serendipity. And serendipity requires proximity. It's the thing that, well, we experience now with 3 grandkids. It's, you might be having a little espresso in the morning, and bang, here comes Zane, 3-year-old through, and this is called serendipity. Unannounced, hey! Broken volume knob and the whole 9 yards. If you don't have serendipity, it's hard to build familiarity, family. So it takes proximity.
I love it. See, now we're getting into it. And I think what you touched on, you did answer the question. You did give us that zoomed out view. And we're going to break for just a second here to transition. But I think what you just did is provoked in each of us. There's something that we're longing for. There's something that we know intuitively we want a way back to, whether it comes with our own family or it comes with neighbors. We know that it's proximal. We know that it's embodied. We know that there's a way forward in it, and we're hungry for it, and we're looking. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about how does that practically work out? Because you're pinging something that's resonating, I think, in all of our hearts. You guys are living it out, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do it. But first, we'll give away coffee, and I'll get 10,000 points because I made it under a minute, right, Lamont? All right, we were high level, and it's good to thank you for helping us zoom out and get the perspective. The challenge, I think, for a lot of us is, and we'll cover a few of these. One is that we have some deep damage in our family currently, and we're hearing this conversation. We're like, yes, I want to move back toward that, but there's some gap that needs ground to cover. So we'll talk about that. Second is we just don't know what are the core competencies for relationship across generational lines. Like there's some things that have been lost and some things that I think we need to recover. So maybe let's start there. What makes it work with you having these serendipitous moments with grandkids and kids in the house? Did you hammer out iron and wine and lock down some good hard rules and contracts before? Was it over dinner and conversation? Are you feeling it out as you go? How did you set up some boundaries that would allow you to flourish and be a family and have some norms, but also the freedom to have serendipity?
Did you say iron and wine just a moment ago?
Yes. I don't even know what that meant.
Yeah, I didn't know what that meant.
I liked the rigor of iron and the boldness of the wine in that. There you go. It's a great band, though.
No, we didn't beat our kids with an iron, and we didn't have them drink wine. So
that's how it's done. Kathy, help us because we don't know what we're doing.
Well, for our family, we really didn't set a lot of boundaries or do a lot of preliminary work, I guess, before we jumped into it. I think we all agreed that we would evaluate as we went along. But also, we have a really open relationship with our kids to where we do confront each other when we need to in a loving way. So we feel that freedom to be able to say, hey, maybe we need to tweak this, or maybe we need to set some boundaries here or whatever. But really, it's been pretty serendipitous for us.
I think it would, in some ways, it has to be. I think if you lead with law in that, if you lead with that, it's not the point. And so there's got to be clear boundaries. There's got to be things put on paper. But yeah, let's get back to the more difficult one. For all of us who are listening, who are going, I want this multi-generational life. Maybe I'm in my 20s or 30s and stuff happened and we heard the great grandiose graduation speeches to go conquer the world and live your dreams, and we did it, and now we're pretty distant. There's been some distance, time and place. As just from your seat, having coached a lot of young people, having been parents and grandparents, for us who are 20 to 30, I'm not, but imagining in that space, what would you say should be a starting point if we long to get back to that? What's the work that we should do today to just start us in the right direction?
Well, I'll toss this out because to echo Kathy, we never really had any grand plan. We did, we took Augustine's maxim seriously that we are what we love. And so we prayed consistently that our kids would grow up to love the things God loves in the order in which He loves them. And Augustine translated Psalm 34:7 that way. Delight yourself in the Lord, will give you the desires of your heart. He said it basically means love God and do what you want to do. So we figured in the long run, our kids are going to do whatever they do, whatever they love. And so if they love the things God loved in the order in which He loved them, they're going to turn out fine. The second thing that we did work hard on, pretty diligently, because we worked hard on it, was we didn't let our kids ever apologize or say they were sorry. We taught them confession. And confession is not a strength in the American church. Confession, the word homologeo means to agree with God, to say the exact same thing God says. So God has never said to me, for example, with Kathy, tell her the reason you just got angry is that she hasn't been very good today to you. I've just never had that happen. So we find most couples actually don't confess. They use that to say, I know I'm angry, but you haven't been very good either. And so we learned how to confess to one another, to confess and then to hear we're forgiven. So we were up until like 3 a.m. one time we were newly married because one of us said, I confess you, I sinned, do you forgive me? I'm trying. And then we said, well, we don't let the sun go down until, so we were up till 3 a.m. It's a joke now, it wasn't then. And our kids, we taught them the same thing. We were on the beach one time, Mark and Stephen go in, we said, come out, confess. They came out and they said, we agree we're never going to talk to one another again. We said, get back in there. And so I think as a start, I don't think we appreciate John's exhortation, confess your sins to one another that you may be, that was rather James, that you may be healed. Healing does not happen if we do not confess. And confession, as we're working with someone right now, is saying no more, but no less than God has said to you, period. And then shut your mouth. So if God has said, Mike, you were mean and you were condescending in what you said, confession is saying, I was mean and condescending. Do you forgive me?
I'm fish on. I'm going to take the bait because I think you're right, and we don't have a lot of reps with confession. We have a ton. I have a ton with saying I'm sorry, but help us out with this idea of confession. I'm thinking again, if I've got a broken relationship with my parents, and even now I'm on a run, I'm driving my car, I'm sitting in the room, and I'm thinking, I need to call them. But it's been a long time. It's been a while. Help us. Let's have that conversation live. How would you coach me if I had that grievance and I needed to be the first mover towards that? Do you call up and say, I have a confession to make?
Well, yeah, it's rather than say I have a confession to make. So first of all, the onus is on God. Confession is opening your body. And I found God has no reticence to say, Mike, you did this and this. So years ago, I was with someone that we'd had a falling out. We were at a wedding in South Carolina, and I came up to him and said, I have done this and it's wrong, and I need forgiveness. That's what God told me to do. So I would say you have to have that sense of, I will open myself to God, His Spirit, who penetrates as deep as the division of soul and spirit, joint and marrow, and will judge the thoughts and the intentions of my conscience. And He has no problem telling me, this is what you did wrong. Go confess.
I think it's difficult when you don't have a relationship with a family member who may not understand even or know how to handle that confession. I think, as believers, I think God just calls us to take those steps over and over and over again, whether it's just simply, like you said, a phone call. I can remember for some in Mike's family, hearing or saying I love you to someone was not a natural thing at all. And I can remember we purposefully told his parents that we loved them at the end of every phone call for years and years and years before we ever heard that back from one of them. And I don't think we ever did from the other one. So it's intentional. It's putting yourself out there, whether it's I love you or whether it's just making a call and saying, how are you doing? That is required of us as believers, that we are required to show love even if we don't feel that love from a family member.
And if I can add one thing, Zach, what Jeremiah meant in Jeremiah 17 about the consciences desperately wicked, and is that we are strangers to ourselves. By that, confession is necessary, because when I began to practice it, I had a mental image of God coming up a path behind me I didn't even know existed, and to say, you just don't really like that person. That's your problem, and I want you to go confess that. Confession is not something we conjure. It is saying the exact same thing that God has said to us. Well, that means you have to not frame up, okay, God, I'm going to come to a confession. I want you to talk about what I don't like about Kathy and how we can get better. So go ahead. And so we said, God, fit in this little box, whatever you want to say on me. You will hear silence. He'll just go, no, not up for that.
Yeah, it's good. I'm hoping, even just as we have the conversation, that for all of us who are longing for that mobile picture, right, and those attachments that can start to form, and that's part of what my hope was in having this conversation, is that you would call your mom or call your dad or call your brother or your uncle. If that's all that happens from this podcast, is you get in your car and you say, hey, you know what? That relationship is meaningful. And maybe I have not given it enough attention. Maybe I just need to stop and pray and say, what's my mobile like? If that's what we take away from tonight, that all of us do have a mobile and we're connected, and that's meaningful. And the more that we can attend to it, and even if that comes down to some really on the ground level confession stuff from us, it's good. It's a way back to a world that's enchanted and isn't shattered into our own corners and just for efficiency and gain, personal gain over and over. And we go to bed at night and we go, I'm longing for something more. What you all have cultivated is beautiful, and I'm grateful for you doing it. Why did you decide to do it? What was your yes? I know we got to wrap up in just a second, but at your station in life, you had made it, you were good, you could go create some distance and some rest, and you chose to lean back in, and you said we want to do it early. You wanted to get right back in there with your grandkids. For people who are listening tonight who are maybe considering it or they're thinking about it, and why did you say, if we're going to do it, we want to do it now?
Well, our grandkids are so young. We wanted to be there for them, and we wanted to build those relationships now with them, so that during their teen years, if they hit those rough streaks where they can't go to their parents, they can come to us. And I feel like we have a perspective. Being a grandparent's a lot more fun than being a parent.
Yeah.
Let me-
Why did we even have kids? Go straight to grandkids.
Let's figure that out.
So the relationships that we build with them are really sweet and tender. And I'm hoping that as they turn into teenagers and adults, that they will see us as the people that have been their biggest cheerleaders.
Yeah, I love it. For people in our situation, we're living on the opposite side of the country from our family because of work. For those of us who have this longing, and it's kind of a twofold question, what can we do to strengthen the bond with our family from a distance? If that's our context, we're working, military, school, whatever, we're just in a different place, but we want to do something to move in this direction. What's some practical advice that you would give us if that's our heart? And then the second are there moves that we can make neighbor to neighbor from Clapham's perspective to say, no, there's something that can happen at a neighborhood and friend level, and how do we start engaging more neighbor to neighbor? Maybe you can split that in half. You can take neighbor to neighbor.
You want to do neighbor to neighbor, or I will? I'll
Take
do
it away, babe.
I'm thinking neighbor to neighbor just because we lived far away. We lived in Louisiana, we lived in Texas, then we lived in Maryland, and our family was in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Michigan. So I prayed for a grandmother for our kids for 2 years when they were very young, and Mike was pastoring at the time. So God gave us a woman who still spends holidays with us to this day. And so pray for those relationships. It might be, we had a couple on Friday nights that were good friends of ours that would come over every Friday night, and they were like our extended family, and we still keep in touch with them today. So it doesn't have to be family members. If you're far away, make your own family. That's what I would say. You get to choose who those people are. That's kind of a benefit.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. I think if there's a will, you'll find a way. See, I came from a family, there wasn't a will, so we could have cobbled together a zillion things, and they always fall apart. With the technologies and everything that are available, I don't think that's the issue. The issue is you got to want it. You got to love it. You have to say, even with all the warts and everything, this is far better than the isolation of a whole lot of silver, boomer, and going to be Gen X than to end up isolated.
It's kind of scary to hear you say boomer and then Gen X right on the heels of that. Like it happens fast. And here we got to wrap it up, but here's the deal. Part of this work to uncover enchanted reality, to pursue life and beauty, to see it cultivate and spring up, is to choose different, to choose and to say there's something that has happened culturally that has led to isolation, and it's led to a despair and a longing that every single one of us is having. And so tonight, think about your mobile. Think about those relationships in your life that are meaningful. Give time to them. Give attention to them. If necessary, give confession in those spaces. It's worth it. It matters. It's part of a much, much bigger story in enchanted reality. And for all of us who are part of this community live here or listening to this podcast, let's be those first movers who not only say this is in a family, in a biological family sense, but we're going to go neighbor to neighbor. And we're going to go multi-generational, intergenerational. So I just want to encourage you. I say you got to have somebody in your life 10 years older than you and 10 years younger than you at all times. Like if you don't have your arm around somebody at least a decade in front of you and a decade behind you, and that's as far as I can reach because my arm's short. But if you can do that, there's a good conversation to happen in the midst of it. So Mike and Kathy, thank you for embodying it so I could stumble upon it and say it's possible, it's good. Thank you for choosing it early and showing that it's possible. Hopefully it provoked something in us and we can lean into it. So thank you all so much. We're grateful.
Thank you.